Oregon was steered in a new direction under Tom McCall.
Surely the 70s must be the decade of environmental reform, the time when we end the insults that we've heaped upon our air, our water, our soil, and our wildlife.
He fulminated against coastal condominium and sagebrush subdivisions.
The interests of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from grasping wastrels of the land.
Oregon was never the same after he was here.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by Stephen and Melissa Babson, the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Oregon Cultural Trust. Additional support provided by Steve and Marilyn Kerman, the Clark Foundation, the Roundhouse Foundation, Fran and John von Schlegel, and viewers like you. Thank you.
McCall wasn't always the innovator in terms of he wasn't always the instigator of the original idea, but he had sense enough to know a good idea when he saw it and to push it when he did.
And he said, this is a good idea, we'll get on it. 1% for art. Money for bike and pedestrian paths. The bottle bill. And you know how he phrased it? We are going to put a price on the head of every bottle and can in this state. Done.
I, Tom McCall,
do solemnly swear
Thomas William Lawson McCall presided over the state of Oregon from 1967 to 1975.
When McCall first entered office, the state was already marketing itself as a beautiful place for people to come to visit, for tourism and so on. But what McCall was able to do that no one had done before was to take that and help create a true Oregon identity. Not just that we live in a beautiful place, but we're a state that steps right up to problems and finds new ways to solve them.
McCall introduced a new approach to economic development, that quality of life and protection of the environment should always come first.
if we can only get through some periods of belt-tightening while I'm governor, forget about adding smokestacks, forget about adding jobs, and maybe we won't have as much bread on our table, so to speak, right now. But if you want industry, you've got to have so much clean industry that it's going to be lined up in a long queue waiting to get into Oregon, because we'll have the things that enlightened industry wants for its workers and for its people when everybody else has destroyed them. So it's a wise economic policy in the long run to keep what you've got in the sense of your natural endowments.
Today, every mile of the Oregon coast is open to the public. Every city, large or small, has a plan for how it will grow. The rivers are cleaner than they used to be. The air is cleaner too.
And he governed successfully. He had ideas that advanced the situation in Oregon. He solved problems, and he got the votes to pass the legislation necessary to do that. That is a great achievement.
McCall is associated so closely with Oregon that folks forget he was the son and the grandson of some very powerful families from Massachusetts.
The McCalls and Lawsons were both high-profile families. Thomas W. Lawson had all the money, and he was one of the richest men of the world, a great financier. And the McCalls were the serious side. They were oriented towards government.
Grandfather Samuel McCall served 20 years in Congress before becoming governor of Massachusetts.
He was academic, he was a writer, he had very strong belief in principles, he stuck to those principles.
In 1910, his son Henry, or Hal, married Dorothy Lawson, daughter of the Wall Street prodigy.
Thomas Lawson had come up from very raw poverty to be worth, at the turn of the century, $40 million.
His daughter's new husband, Hal, wanted to be a rancher. So Lawson bought the young couple 640 acres near Prineville, Oregon, and built them a very large house.
A fabulous place sitting out there in the middle of the Crooked River Valley. A New England-style house with sleeping porches and maid's quarters.
Tom McCall was born in 1913, but not here. His grandfather Lawson had insisted that Dorothy return to his home back east to deliver Tom and his 4 siblings.
He would spend part of the season, the winter months, with his mother, who did not like the West, back with Grandpa and all this wealth in this huge mansion in Massachusetts. Then he would spend the summers in the ranch under Rimrock, running around, playing like kids do. And there were clear streams, he loved to fish, and he developed this love of the land very naturally. It was very organic with him because he lived it.
Tom McCall spent his childhood being shuttled back and forth between Prineville and Boston, where he went to private schools, was chauffeured around in limousines, and he would get on a train and return to what was a very austere, rough place to grow up.
By the early 1920s, the Lawson financial empire had collapsed, a loss felt directly by young Tom McCall's parents.
Once they started to run out of money, their lives had to change from being connected to the East and the wealth and the power to really being true pioneers out in the Oregon desert. They couldn't pay their electricity. The lights would get turned off because they couldn't pay the bill. They would sometimes not have enough money for clothes. And yet the house would be filled with amazing, wonderful furniture and hundreds of leather-bound books that represented this history, this legacy of culture and influence that they had come from.
Dorothy McCall, once a pampered heiress with servants, now learned to cook.
She became just a workhorse. She prepared the meals for all the ranch hands, all the crew that came in to do the harvest. She did all the cleaning. This is a massive house, and she's doing this all herself.
The McCall kids had to find ways to entertain themselves, and one of the things they did was to produce a family newspaper. They reported on the death of chickens to the hatchet. They reported on trips to the grocery store. They reported on fights between their parents. And the newspaper was called The World.
Tom McCall discovered a giant tick on his chest. He quickly called 8 doctors, whose combined efforts finally dislodged the insect.
Imagine, if you will, every night, the fire burning in this vast, big fireplace, and McCall's mother reading to him and his siblings from this wonderful collection of leather-bound books that his millionaire grandfather had shipped out to the ranch. Poe, Dickens, Thackeray, these are all authors that McCall mentioned that had a huge influence on him. And she would read every night for hours. And this is how McCall's vocabulary grew. This is how his ability to speak grew. Most importantly, McCall learned how to tell a story.
He majored in journalism at the University of Oregon. He had to sit out a couple of terms when his family could not afford the tuition. His mother liquidated some family assets to keep Tom in school.
And she sold that jewelry, she sold the handmade shotguns and stuff so the family could keep going during the hard times. She paid for the children's education that way.
And soon after graduation, he landed a newspaper reporter job in Moscow, Idaho.
And he very much adopted that look. He got the fedora, he had this dangling cigarette.
At the News Review, McCall wrote some of the news and all of the daily sports section, sometimes even in verse.
He wrote about hunting and fishing, which gave him a real sense of conservation. He did nothing else but basically write news stories every single day. The first decade of his career, being that reporter, collecting that information, making sense of it, was absolutely key to the success that he had as governor later.
On assignment one day, he met Audrey Owen, whom he would marry and be with for the rest of his life.
My father and my mother shared a very deep love. They had a great relationship.
Tom McCall liked to gamble and had run up some debts that would not go away.
He told me that the editor sat him down one time and said, "Tom, you've got to leave town so you can pay your bills."
So in 1942, Tom and Audrey left Idaho for Portland, where he went to work for the Oregonian newspaper, and where he did, in time, pay off those debts. The paper owned 2 radio stations, and in the years that followed, he would work at both.
That's the latest from KGW, First Person News.
Near the end of World War II, 31-year-old McCall enlisted.
After serving in the Navy, he came back to Portland and got involved with Young Republicans. This was a group of very progressive Republicans who wanted to change their party.
In 1949, he got the attention of the sitting governor, Douglas McKay.
And McCall went to work for Doug McKay as his chief of staff. And for more than 2 years, Tom McCall was essentially the eyes and ears of the governor of Oregon. And it was an incredible perch for a young man to see how state government truly worked from the inside, to understand who the power players were and how power really worked.
KGW Radio hired him back, giving him a nightly show devoted entirely to politics. He grew increasingly popular and respected as all of Portland got to know his voice.
The task force found that a builder often had to contact as many as a score of different government agencies to collect the permits he needed.
My grandmother would spend a lot of time talking about the specialness of the Lawsons and the specialness of the McCalls, and that we had a responsibility to give back to the community, to give back to the state.
In 1954, Tom McCall decided to test the waters of politics.
A lot of people don't remember it, but he actually ran for Congress in the 1950s against a young woman named Edith Green.
She had this image as this matronly, quiet, reserved character. But in fact, she was outspoken, she was fiery, and up close, you would want her in a knife fight. She was very tough, and McCall had no idea what he was getting into when he faced her in the general election in 1954.
My dad was a journalist. There wasn't much money in journalism in those days. So the Republican Party brought him money, but they also gave him some orders on how to run that campaign.
In truth, he and the Democrat Green held similar views on many issues.
In order to distinguish himself, McCall had to portray himself as much more conservative than he really was. This ran against everything he knew to be right, against his principles. He abandoned those principles. He decided that he was going to do whatever it took to get elected.
As Election Day neared, the polls showed a close race. McCall's backers wrote a speech for him, which at first he refused to read.
And yet he caved in and went on in a 10-minute broadcast and read what he admitted later was probably the most vicious speech he ever gave.
The speech characterized Edith Green as just a little woman as a puppet whose strings are being pulled by the labor bosses.
The Eastern big bosses, who are such clever ventriloquists, have put the words into the lady's mouth. Friends, it's mighty hard to fight a puppet.
Of course, here's McCall at 6'5", and Edith Green, who's barely 5'2", and he was seen as a bully.
I am sure the lady is an expert in the kitchen, but ladies and gentlemen, it takes more than a cookbook to cope with the destinies of the people of Oregon and of this great nation.
And before you knew it, all around the city, he had developed a reputation as someone who was willing to attack not just his opponent, but as she was known at the time, the female candidate, the lady candidate. He was badly beaten in that race.
Edith Green would go on to serve 10 terms in Congress, becoming the most powerful woman in Oregon political history. McCall would later describe that speech as the most shameful thing he ever did.
He had lost everything. He was out of work. His credibility had been damaged. He was now known as someone who would say or do anything to get elected. The day after that election, Tom McCall had to begin again. He had to start rebuilding this reputation in this career that he had, in some ways, thrown away in this race.
Very soon after that, I called him to see if I could come chat. I said, actually, I've come to see you because I want you to consider joining the Oregon Historical Society board. But he said, I'm broke, I don't have anything, and besides, I lost. You don't want losers, that's not what you're looking for. And I said, you've lost this election, but you are going to be a winner around here for a long time.
Before long, Tom McCall was back on the air.
Governor Mark Hatfield, Oregon's 37-year-old chief executive.
In the 1960s, a lot of people, including an awful lot of newspaper people, viewed television as, kind of a show rather than serious journalism. So that was really a mistake as regards Tom.
Well, Governor, let's move right to the local political level, that is the statewide level. Do you have any
Tom began to use more opinion and more analysis in his news appearances, and that made him different than anyone else in town. No one else was doing that.
And no other news personality, probably in the whole country, was doing what McCall was about to undertake. By 1962, he had become a familiar face on the KGW Nightly News. He joined news director Tom Dargan to report on the notoriously polluted river that ran through Portland.
The Willamette at its worst was pretty bad. For decades, cities all up and down the river would pump raw sewage right in. Paper mills would put their wastes straight into the river, changing the temperature and the chemical makeup. It got to be so bad that there were times in which the river had no dissolved oxygen. In other words, there was no capacity to support life whatsoever.
The state sanitary authority regards the entire Willamette River, that is all the way downstream from Salem, as too filthy for swimming. Where these wastes are not treated in a safe manner, the effluent becomes an oxygen-gulping, slime-making scourge. It destroys fish life, sometimes forming into rafts that rise to the surface as sluggish, foul-smelling masses of filth.
Pollution in Paradise, for the first time, collected everything that was known about the conditions in the state and put it all into a one-hour documentary. You didn't understand how bad a problem or how much it was affecting the Oregon economy and Oregon's reputation until Tom McCall put it in front of you.
The show aired in November of 1962.
City dwellers may someday have to live in air-disinfected homes and offices, venturing forth into the sunlight with a plastic headpiece and a private supply of oxygen.
Within months, lawmakers passed wide-ranging updates of Oregon's pollution controls and cracked down on many practices that had gone unregulated for years.
McCall was one of the most recognizable figures in the state. For him to step out and document and truly investigate the issue of pollution gave him a message, gave him a platform. So in 1964, 2 years after the documentary aired, he decided to run for Secretary of State. And won very handily. He won largely on his name.
The younger of McCall's two sons, Sam, was now in his teens. An earlier illness had left him with a drug dependency, something Sam would never kick.
This was the toughest thing for our family. Drug abuse wasn't well known back in the 60s. My father, when he was Secretary of State, there was first this revelation that there was going to be news that my brother had been involved in drugs. And my dad called the family together and said, I have to resign. It was a very grim night. But every time he hit that low point, he'd pull himself up together, and the next day he'd be back with a new plan and ready to go again.
In fact, the press reported little or nothing about McCall's situation at home.
None of us really thought that it was general public business that Tom had a kid with some addiction problems. It just wasn't part of the game in those days.
McCall's 2 years as Secretary of State passed without much distinction, but Oregon's population and economy were growing fast. Oregon was ready for a change. And Tom McCall set his sights on the governor's office.
This is a guy who, when running for public office, courting Republicans and Democrats, turned to the now defunct pulp mill at Albany and referred to it as a festering cancer on the broad green bosom of the Willamette Valley. Okay? And he could get away with that.
And that's the kind of governor they wanted in 1966. They wanted a governor who was going to push Oregon into new directions and push Oregon forward. Tom McCall happened to be at a pivotal point in history. He came to power in January of 1967 when Oregon was poised to take off.
In this, certainly the proudest hour of my life.
In my opinion, being a governor is the best elected position in the United States. You have a chance working with the legislature to make some real changes in your state.
And that was a time of great cooperation between the political parties in Oregon. People, they didn't vote for their party. They didn't vote for a particular ideology, and they were considered weird if they did. They all came together and tried to figure out what was in the best interests of Oregon and Oregonians, and that's how they voted.
Tom was known for kind of ambling through the Capitol. People would come up and chat with him, and he would go down, have his lunch or coffee in the state capitol coffee shop, and people would feel free to come and join him at the table.
McCall loved people. He loved to talk to them, loved to engage with them, wanted to hear what they were really thinking.
And you were raised on a farm where they had Holsteins.
That's right.
So was I.
Oh, very good.
Okay, one more question. State reports, letters I got to read.
And that's great, but if you have a state to run, you need to be in meetings, you need to be paying attention to detail. And what saved Tom McCall in particularly his first term, was that he had a terrific staff.
His executive assistant was Ed Westerdahl, a one-time Army intelligence officer. Ron Schmidt, a public relations wizard, served as McCall's press secretary. Both men were just 30 years old when McCall took office.
And they were with him every step of the way. And you have to understand, McCall desperately needed handlers. He was terribly disorganized, and these guys helped fashion an organization for him.
Still, some members of the legislature were slow to accept him.
He had, in their view, just waltzed right into office because of his fame on television. So McCall's biggest challenge when he got to be governor was to be taken seriously by the lawmakers.
He got the attention of the legislature, perhaps for the first time, when the public's right to Oregon's beaches became threatened. Back in 1913, Oregon Governor Oswald West had declared that every Oregon beach would belong to all Oregonians, and public access to the sand and surf would remain unfettered. But in 1966, an Oregon Circuit Court ruled that the only public part of a beach was the wet part. That year, a businessman in Cannon Beach fenced off the dry sand beach in front of his motel. Up and down the coast, other beachfront property owners began to follow suit. Some citizens expressed their outrage.
We do not approve of playing fast and loose with the public's rights on Oregon's beaches.
The State Highway Department brought forward a bill to try to clear up where the public line was on the beach. But the Republicans who were in the Oregon House at the time and were controlling the Oregon House had no interest in getting into this issue.
At first, House Bill 1601, written to stop the looming threat to beach access, received little attention from the public or the press.
It wasn't until Governor McCall decided to make an issue of it that it suddenly made headlines.
We were comfortable in the feeling that the beaches belong to the public. The discussion around this bill involves questions that raise doubt as to whether the public, even so, can reach those beaches.
Tom McCall took what was otherwise an obscure issue and basically pounded his fist and went on the desk and went straight to the press and said this is outrageous. And overnight, this was a huge issue.
We must fight to reestablish, in fact, in the most meaningful way, the concept of the public ownership of our beaches established by that great Oregonian, Oz West, some 50 to 55 years ago. This we cannot live without as Oregonians.
He knew how to get the public's attention, as he did one day on Cannon Beach.
Well, you saw helicopters cresting the Coast Range, these blades whipping the air, and outstepping the 6.5-foot tall governor of Oregon, literally drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where the public ownership should be, and this is where it's going to be.
There were surveyors marking out the stakes and all this sort of thing, and it was great media, a great show. Television viewers in particular weighed in and flooded the legislature with letters and came down for hearings and everything. And it became impossible for the opponents of the beach bill to sustain the opposition.
Once nearly dead in committee, the beach bill passed and survived the bevy of legal challenges that followed.
McCall had a good relationship with the press because he was one of us.
I think it's time that the unorganized American, who by poll after poll, year after year, wants some kind of reasonable gun control legislation, had his druthers.
And he talked in ways that supplied what we needed. It helped him get his message across. The bad side of that is we let him get away with things.
Back during his campaign, McCall had sought the support of Glenn Jackson, one of the most powerful businessmen in the state. Jackson was also head of the Oregon State Highway Commission, and for his help, he had asked McCall to endorse a project.
And McCall said yes without really thinking. For years, the State Highway Division was trying to straighten out Highway 101 along the coast. The plan was to drive the new route of 101 right through an area called the Nestucca Spit, which is near Pacific City. The local residents complained that this new highway was going to essentially ruin the beach, going to go right through a precious estuary and go through a natural area. There was no place for a highway. McCall didn't understand the issue. And at that time, McCall really needed Jackson's support, and he just agreed to it, not understanding what he was committing to.
In fact, endorsed the proposed route.
The plan to put the highway on the spit exploded into controversy.
Beaches are for recreation. Beaches are for kids. Beaches are for walking with some degree of quietness and solitude. There are lots of other places. There's lots of other real estate where highways can go.
For a while, McCall stayed the course of support.
And this would only add to the use and the enhancement of the beaches along the proposed route.
He began to realize what a mistake this had been. He desperately tried to backtrack, but by then it was too late. He had already been out there in favor of it. He hadn't really thought the issue through.
Public resistance finally drove the plan to be abandoned.
If it weren't for Bob Straub, his opposition, and his ability to stop this highway, there would be a big highway right up the beach right now.
And we never covered that the way we probably should have.
It was the one time McCall really became beholden to someone with that kind of power. And once he realized the mistake he made, he never did it again.
McCall got a pass on that without really being called to account.
His leadership would be tested again in 1968 at the Oregon State Prison just outside Salem.
McCall had worked on the issue of prison reform for many, many years before he ever ran for office. This was something that was personally important to him. He wanted to change the system from one of punishment to one of reformation.
But the state prison was not a model institution. Treatment of prisoners here could be harsh. The facility was being poorly managed.
And McCall took it very seriously.
He was aware of most of the problems, and he knew that tensions were on the rise. He realized the warden should be replaced, but publicly he downplayed the troubles at the prison. He had underestimated how bad the troubles had become.
He took an out-of-state trip, and while he was out of town, the state prison erupted in a riot.
It was on a weekend that the prison was set on fire by inmates, and they took hostages.
Back then, an Oregon governor relinquished all authority while away from the state. McCall was in New York. The power of governor had flowed to the Senate president, and he had put McCall's executive assistant in charge.
I got a call from Ed Westerdahl. He asked me if I could come to the prison and help them with taking notes of what transpired. I took notes the whole night of the negotiations, what the prisoners were asking for, what the public officials were willing to do and not do.
The riot lasted about 16 hours. It caused $1.8 million in damages and injured more than 30 people. McCall returned the following day.
And to a lot of Oregonians, it looked like he wasn't in control of the situation. He wanted reforms. And this was a tragedy for him personally because he understood that a riot of the magnitude that they had at the Oregon State Prison set back these issues years.
But I want you to know that I'm releasing at this time still another appeal directly to the President of the United States.
Tom McCall's first real confrontation with the United States government occurred in early 1970. For years, a large quantity of American military nerve gas had been stockpiled in Okinawa, Japan. But now the Okinawans wanted it removed. President Nixon ordered the gas, enough to kill millions of people, transferred to a weapons repository in Umatilla, Oregon.
At that time, most people didn't know that near Hermiston, Oregon, the Umatilla Army Depot was storing thousands and thousands of canisters of nerve agents, some of it dating back to World War I.
Down these tracks on the Umatilla Army Depot, some estimates say will come 700 train car loads of nerve gas GB and VX and a World War II mustard-type gas.
Northwesterners wanted no part of the cargo's transport or storage. McCall led the fight to stop what he called a lethal but non-essential sort of garbage.
1,900 signatures in 7 days' work. We, the undersigned, demand federal action that will halt the shipment of nerve gas to Oregon. It's incredible to me that the federal government is destroying this kind of gas in other centers of the United States while contending that it's necessary to bring more of these highly dangerous agents into the state of Oregon, using Oregon, in effect, as a dumping ground for materials.
He appealed to officials in Washington, D.C.
They listen to you very politely, and you can see they're just hoping that this boob will get out of their hair in 5 minutes so they can go ahead and do what they were going to do anyhow.
And for months, the shipment seemed unstoppable.
The Defense Department says, on the one hand, that this is an operation that can be conducted safely, and yet has structured into the plans the contingency for a disaster and the clearing of a 20-mile area through evacuation.
But in late May 1970, President Nixon canceled the plan. The gas was sent to a remote Pacific island and destroyed. McCall had taken a public issue, made it his own, and won.
Tom McCall was popular and engaging as a political leader, but as an administrator, he wasn't all that good. Didn't like detail.
His early efforts at land use planning were not always popular, and he often found himself at odds with his own political party.
He was standing up to pulp and paper mills saying, you have to clean up your act. He was constantly taking on the notion that any development is good development, which ran counter to this traditional Republican notion that government should get out of the way of business.
And Democrat Bob Straub, a strong opponent, would be running against McCall for the governor's seat.
By the time he was starting to face re-election in 1970, there was a very real possibility that he might not be reelected.
He would end up betting his political future on the outcome of a single event, a rock festival called Vortex. In the summer of 1970, the war in Vietnam raged on. The American Legion, which supported the war, would be holding its convention in Portland, and President Nixon was scheduled to speak. But the FBI warned the governor that large numbers of anti-war activists from around the country might also be coming to protest, perhaps violently.
And my father was at wit's end about how to deal with this. He really didn't know. He's an American Legion, he's VFW, but on the other hand, he's sympathetic to the youth.
A few young Portlanders had pitched an idea to the governor's staff, a festival of life to be named Vortex 1, far from Portland, to entice young people out of the city and away from the convention. The idea sounded crazy.
And he said, I have just made my decision. I have just committed political suicide. We're going to have Vortex.
I know it costs money, it shouldn't be done, but the whole alternative is the possibility of bloodshed.
The site would be McIver Park, about 30 miles from downtown.
To open up a state park for essentially what was a 3-day pot party, a rock festival. And the state was going to pay the bills, and there were going to be no arrests. And at the time, it was not at all clear that this idea was going to work. McCall understood that there were times in which you had to just bet it all. This festival that went on at McIver Park, Clackamas County, went off relatively without a hitch.
Tens of thousands of people attended the Vortex event. A few thousand more demonstrated peacefully in Portland, while the American Legion Convention transpired as planned.
McCall's solution, as crazy as it sounded, actually worked.
Vortex was probably the most surprising thing that occurred during my father's tenure, and I think it was really maybe a turning point. When he could succeed in Vortex, what could he fail at?
He could take big chances and could make them work, and it made him a totally different type of governor in his second term.
The demarcation line was Vortex, and after that, McCall became an unstoppable political force in the state. The bottle bill, land use planning, the finishing of the cleaning up of the Willamette, energy conservation, all the things that McCall became famous for happened in a very short period of time in his second term.
Probably the best-known pronouncement Tom McCall ever made came soon after his re-election.
I urged them to come and come many, many times to enjoy the beauties of Oregon, but I also urged them, for heaven's sake, don't move here to live.
It was such a stunning thing for people to hear a governor say. It almost sounded like he was saying, everyone just stay out.
Of course the slogan didn't work. People were coming anyway. But what McCall started was a conversation about the time, the way, and the place that all that took place. Where would we put the people?
From the very beginning, a drumbeat started about McCall, that he was bad for business in Oregon. Many businesses came here, many businesses expanded here. But that drumbeat has continued to this day.
I was trying to get people to come here and build buildings and create jobs. And I keep hearing, come visit, don't stay. I made a trip to the Middle East, among other trips. I heard that in the Middle East, for crying out loud.
Did he set the state on a path that made it more difficult for business to thrive here? Or did he simply raise a higher standard and say, if you're going to come here, you need to operate under different rules, and you have to understand that we are trying to protect our livability? That's still a debate today.
He did anger some in the business sector, the aluminum industry, beverage companies, bottle makers, and grocery store owners when he took up the fight for an Oregon bottle bill. McCall had long spoken out against roadside litter.
In Oregon, it's a multi-million-dollar annual insult to the environment of the most beautiful of the 50 states.
A lot of Oregonians thought that there was too much trash. This whole throwaway society was a bad idea. But McCall helped sell it by putting it into words.
I think that Oregonians are simply too proud of people to smudge this magnificent spot, this sunset frontier of our nation, with careless, abandoned debris. We can do better,
Our past and our future demand that we do better. So the challenge is given to us all, and I would say to you, ladies and gentlemen, let us now be about the task.
The idea of the bottle bill came not from Tom McCall, but from a citizen who lived in Salem. He was an avid hiker and outdoorsman and had seen this huge increase in bottles and cans littering Oregon wherever he went.
The legislature had considered a bottle bill during McCall's first term. He had not endorsed it, saying the time was not right, and the bill had failed. Now, 3 years later, the time had come.
And he essentially took the bottle bill and made it his own issue. He stood up and said, we are going to do this, and we're going to make this bill happen.
The bill would shift some of the cost of bottle and can disposal onto the beverage industry.
There were warnings about how it was going to cost tens of thousands of jobs, and it was going to close plants, and stores would have to shut down. At least one legislator stood up on the floor of, I think, the Senate and said, you know, I was offered a bribe to vote against this bill. It was a very intense battle to pass that bottle bill.
I know why most bottlers in Oregon may well be on my side. It's because they were Oregonians before they became bottlers, because they were in love with their beautiful state first and became businessmen later.
If there's one thing that he did that hasn't been done quite the same by any governor that I know of, and that is to ignite the people out there to understand there's something here that's really good and they really ought to go for it. It takes a certain individual to be able to do that.
The bottle bill, the first in the nation, became law in 1971. Since then, Oregon's clean roadsides have inspired many other similar bills across the country, but the intense opposition continues. And only 9 other states have mandatory deposit laws today.
What it really did was set the groundwork for recycling in Oregon, and has put Oregon way out ahead of many states.
The following year, he introduced a new phrase to the Oregon vocabulary.
Death with dignity, or dying with dignity, as some now insist on calling it.
Out of nowhere, Tom McCall starts talking about this.
It's the idea that a person may freely decide not to allow that his life be artificially maintained by chemicals and mechanical contrivances when all hope for life is gone. It allows a patient to call upon his doctor to abandon truly heroic measures.
It shocked people, but it also began a long conversation that has brought us in some ways to where we are today in Oregon.
Years later, Oregon would be the first state in the nation to legalize physician-assisted suicide. About this time, McCall himself was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The cancer and the surgery that followed would slow him down, and he had other concerns as well.
Sam's problems with addiction were taking a huge toll on Tom McCall personally. His staff could see it, people who knew McCall could see it. He would be up all night dealing with his son and having to come into work all day and try to deal with the issues of the state.
It was wearing on him. I think the governor renewed himself by coming to work because it was a way to do something positive rather than having to deal with the problems he was having. Luckily, Governor McCall had a wonderful marriage, and his wife took care of the issues at home. So it allowed him to be the governor.
My mother was really a wonderful, warm person. She was extremely well organized. She ran all the finances. She kept everything straight in the family. And she was the best thing that ever happened to my father.
The governor's mother, Dorothy, also provided support in a style all her own.
I never had any run-ins with Dorothy McCall, but she was a particular character. And I think some of Tom's personality was owed to being raised by a very eccentric mother. She was known for calling up people, sometimes in the middle of the night and weighing in.
And I'm sure you've heard the story about her, Dorothy McCall calling the President of the United States.
She called LBJ up. She called the White House and said, I'm Dorothy Lawson, and my son, Tom McCall, is not returning the call. I want the President to do something about this. And so the President called my Tad up and said, I think there's a lady out there who says she's your mother, and she's complaining that you're not calling her. Would you please give her a call?
In the winter of '73, not much rain fell in the Pacific Northwest. Water levels behind the hydroelectric dams stayed low and power generation dropped. By spring, the prospect of large-scale electricity shortages seemed likely. McCall urged Oregonians to cut back on their power usage, to lower thermostats, to wear sweaters.
During one of the staff meetings, somebody suggested that maybe we should order the lights being turned out.
McCall issued an executive decree.
The governor ordered that all of the lights, outdoor lights, were turned off. Christmas lights, all these big fancy marketing lights.
Elsewhere, President Nixon pushed to loosen environmental restrictions on power plants and to step up construction of the Alaska pipeline. Oregon's governor was calling for conservation. It was not his most popular executive action, and in reality, he had no legal authority to order it. But across the state, the lights stayed off for weeks.
It did demonstrate what the issue was and how much energy we were using that we may not need, if we really wanted to conserve.
No sooner had Oregon lit back up than the national gasoline shortage slammed through the state. For 5 months, an Arab oil embargo left Oregon virtually without gas. In early 1974, most of the state's service stations had closed for lack of product to sell. Long lines of cars idled at every open station, clogging the streets, polluting the air, until that day's supply was gone. A McCall staff member had an idea.
He said, you know something? All of Oregon's license plates end in a number. People with odd license numbers could fill up on a day, and then the next day the even numbers could fill up. We could cut the daily demand in half. I like that, said McCall, odd even. It worked in Oregon, and pretty quick people were adopting it all over the country.
McCall would pour much of his own energy into 2 more bills, ones he considered to be among the most important of his career.
Oregon is growing very fast. 300,000 plus people move here in the period of 1960 to 1970. Schools are crowded. Roads are inadequate.
And there were subdivisions going in where there was sewage in the gutters, in the streets, because there wasn't any planning for the sewage system.
Developers were buying up some of the state's best farmland to subdivide.
And McCall, of course, is intimately concerned, very much concerned about the urban sprawl.
The interests of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from grasping wastrels of the land. We must respect another truism, that unlimited and unregulated growth leads inexorably to a lowered quality of life.
All Oregon counties had land use plans, but they were, so to speak, all over the map. So much so that one county, Clackamas, actually eliminated all its zoning requirements. The impetus for a comprehensive plan came first from the rural sector, from farmers who wanted to farm their land rather than parcel it out to developers. Legislators crafted a planning strategy built around a list of statewide goals, and Tom McCall took the plan to the people.
McCall always saw land use planning as a team effort. Cities and counties must be empowered to do their own planning, but it must be under the purview of state guidelines.
It was always a controversial idea.
A lot of people thought that the state had no role in trying to tell people how to use their land.
The solution was several years in the making, through countless hours of hearings, meetings, backroom give and take, and occasional arm twisting. But in May 1973, Governor McCall signed Senate Bill 100, Oregon's unprecedented land use planning law. It featured a new concept, the urban growth boundary, requiring cities to contain most of their urban development within a defined area. The law represented a unique approach to managing growth. McCall even co-founded an organization to protect it.
I'm an advisor to 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is the only single-purpose public interest law firm in the United States. Single purpose is that it takes care of one bill, which is Senate Bill 100.
It was also short on detail, leading to years of legal wrangling.
But by and large, it served us pretty well. You know, the population continues to grow, but it does so in a relatively orderly fashion.
Tom McCall may be best known for his environmentalism, but the masterwork he presented to the Oregon people was a tax plan. Measure 1. So important to him that he named it the McCall Tax Plan. This was not a sales tax. It would limit property taxes and shift school funding to the state. It would raise corporate and personal income taxes, with the bulk of the increase going to the wealthiest people. The McCall tax plan would have helped stabilize support for schools and would have likely averted the more drastic property tax limitation measures that voters passed in later years.
This was a very progressive tax plan. It was probably the best chance that Oregonians have had in the last at least half century to progressively reform our taxes, and it failed.
He took that as a rejection of himself. And he was very, he said, I've failed, I've misread the people, I'm really disappointed.
Back in 1962, his investigation of the Willamette River had led Tom McCall to the much bigger story of pollution throughout the state.
He kept setting his sights higher and higher. In fact, by the time he left office, he wasn't talking anymore just about how to protect Oregon, but how the entire nation, and in some ways the world, could be more environmentally conscious. McCall became one of the most outspoken advocates of sustainability at a time when it wasn't really being discussed. And that's what made him not just a hero in Oregon, but also a national figure as well.
We will rededicate ourselves to the improvement of our environment, to the profit of all generations to come.
He left office in 1975, having annoyed the Republican Party one last time by endorsing the Democratic candidate, Bob Straub, over Republican Vic Atiyeh.
Commentary, provocatively written and delivered by Oregon's outspoken former governor, Tom McCall.
Tom McCall returned to news.
Big business and big labor will always own Congress on the bottle bill. But the people have power too, out where the winds of freedom still blow.
In 1978, he ran again for governor.
You gonna be the next governor? Well, we're striving in that direction.
But times had changed. He had changed, and he lost in the primary to Vic Atiyeh. But he never lost his flair for the dramatic. In 1980, now Governor Atiyeh unveiled a new Welcome to Oregon sign at the California border.
I asked Tom to go with me. That was probably his very last public event.
Atiyeh knew the risks of having Tom McCall at a press affair.
Oregon is demure and lovely, and it ought to play a little hard to get. And I think you'll all be just as sick as I am if we find it is nothing but a hungry hussy throwing herself at every stinking smokestack that's offered.
Nobody quartered me on that trip. I didn't mind.
McCall was now engaged in an all-out battle with cancer. On the political front, the land use reforms he had achieved as governor were also under attack.
It was a ballot measure in the fall of 1982 that would absolutely wipe out everything that he had done in terms of land use planning, which he saw as the key to helping Oregon grow in a way that made sense, both environmentally and also economically.
Tom McCall had seen his hard-fought tax plan, his would-be gift to the people of Oregon, go down to defeat.
We invested 15 months of our lives in that, working as hard as we could.
He was not going to sit by and watch land use planning be repealed.
But this activist loves Oregon more than life. He can't have both very long. But the trade-off with me is perfectly okay. But if the legacy we have helped give Oregon, and which made it twinkle afar, well, if it goes, I guess I wouldn't want to live in Oregon anyhow.
And to see McCall emaciated and weak and standing up with his incredibly strong voice and telling Oregonians, this really matters, turned it all around.
Oregonians honored McCall's appeal and voted the ballot measure down.
Because they heard what McCall was saying. And there hasn't been a serious challenge in 30 years to land use planning after that. And within a couple of months after that election, McCall was dead.
I worked for Governor McCall for 7.5 years. I'm not sure that I realized how special it could be until it was no more.
What he was able to do as governor was shift the attention from the old ways of doing things to a new way. To consider what the state was going to look like in 20 years instead of in the next 20 minutes. The expectations for leaders in this state changed forever after Tom McCall. It wasn't good enough just to hold office. You had to lead. You had to look ahead. You had to be a thinker about the future in Oregon to be considered a success as a leader. And that's the result of Tom McCall.
There's more about Tom McCall on Oregon Experience online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, please visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by Stephen and Melissa Babson, the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Oregon Cultural Trust. Additional support provided by Steve and Marilyn Kerman, the Clark Foundation, the Roundhouse Foundation, Fran and John von Schlegel, and viewers like you. Thank you.